Dear friends, I'm discuss with you today the direction the global economy is heading to in those troubled times, a theme which is dear to the convinced European believer that I am, as a former EU commissioner and now chair of the Cour des Comptes of France. This is why I would like to warmly thank the International Economic Forum of the Americas for organizing this unique event. My main point will be as follows. In those times of profound uncertainty, which you all know, long-lasting stagflation is a non-negligible risk that will put our public finances under great pressure. First of all, I would like to recall and underline the current indicators that are worrying and might be long-lasting. The present slowdown may result in an elongated period of low growth and stock inflation. In detail, global growth is estimated to slump from 5.7% in 2021 to 2.2% in 2023. And this situation is expected to hover around the pace over 2023-2024 as the war in Ukraine disrupts activity, investment, trade, and fiscal and monetary policy accommodation is withdrawn. Rising energy prices will, we all know that, reduce real incomes, increase production costs, tighten financial conditions, and influence macroeconomic policy, especially in energy importing countries such as ours. In terms of inflation, the global average currently stands at 7.4%. This will affect the poor households the most because basic expenses weigh much more heavily on their income. Electricity, gas for eating, food, and it's not over yet. Even if some signs of stabilization tend to show. On Wednesday, Jay Powell said, while announcing a new interest rate raise, that we do not yet have a sufficiently restrictive monetary policy. And you know that is also the feeling of the ECB, and which is in a quite, would say, tough stance. As for global public debt, the World Bank judged that 2021 improvement is likely to be temporary. We are experiencing one of the most internationally synchronous episodes of monetary and fiscal policy tightening the world has seen in 50 years. Economies throughout the world have little room for maneuver, and that's the case for us in France due to a quite significant debt to GDP ratio of some 113%, as national debt and deficit reached exponential levels, not to mention the rise of interest rates by Western central banks to handle their own debt and deficit. All states are affected by this scenario, and this includes the Global South, which will likely be the most impacted in the second round effect. Overall, we might say that the current situation, with significant and positive differences, I must insist on that, can tend to look like the 70s. Inflation caused by raw material supply issues, growth weakening, and developing economies facing vulnerabilities with respect to the monetary policy tightening of Western economy. But the background is tense, as public finances constraints are higher, which in turn tie our hands even maybe more than in the past, and we will have to deal with that in the future. I would like now to go back to the structural causes behind this risk, which I would call stagflation, even if, again, I'm not pessimistic, but I would say alarmed. The first one would be the era of uncertainty we are living in. The current international socioeconomic landscape is a component of a larger context that my old friend Jean-Claude Juncker, former president of the European Commission, used to call a polycrisis. That was back in 2016. Nearly 7 years after, The economic, political, and ecological issues feed one another, leaving everyone with a sense of serious worry. COVID crisis already forced economies to decrease sharply and put public finances under great stress. In advanced economies, public debt rose in 2020 from around 70% of GDP to 124% of GDP. To 70% was 2007 before the financial crisis. Furthermore, the war in Ukraine caused a near unseen inflation shock in European economies due to rising energy prices. The retail gas price in Europe has roughly doubled in just a year. I also have to outline other systematic risks threatening the two major global powers of our international system. Regarding the United States first, their inflation is much different than ours because their unemployment rate is currently at 3.7%. In France, for example, it's over 7%. Inflation has reached 7.1%, which is comparable to the peak we are going to see in January in France, and I hope that it will decrease afterwards. This is a typical situation of an overeating economy. And the US government recently enacted an Inflation Reduction Act that incidentally caused tensions with European governments. You might have noticed the visit of our president, Emmanuel Macron, to the US, where he defined that as a kind of aggression. And I hope that there will be discussions between the US and Europe in the year to come. As for China, the main challenge is to tackle a long-lasting growth slowdown, combined with the potential real estate bubble and the end of the zero COVID policies, which is having some spectacular consequences that we cannot really foresee at the time being. Especially, authorities issued directives to rescue the property sector after the bailout of Evergrande last year, to prevent what I would call a Lehman moment. These measures range from addressing the liquidity crisis among developers to loosening down payment requirements for home buyers. In the meantime, inequalities still proliferate all over the globe. And of course, this is something we have to tackle. That is our duty. And it's not only a moral duty, it's also an economical duty. Despite continued economic growth in emerging countries over the past 2 decades, the income share of the poorest 50% remains historically low, and the average income of the 10 top percent of the wealthiest people is 38 times higher than the said bottom 50%. The second structural explanation for this long-lasting crisis is the unavoidable ecological dilemma. We could be dealing with a serious vicious circle, as the idea of a short-term trade-off between climate risk and economic and financial risk would be misleading. The activation of traditional anti-inflationary instruments, such as rate hikes, risks precipitating a debt crisis and therefore hinder the massive investment that are indispensable for the ecological transition, which can only reinforce structural inflation of climate origin. Isabel Schnabel, a member of the executive board of the ECB, was defining in March of this year the fossilflation, which reflects our dependence on fossil fuels, whose prices will remain high, and climate inflation, on the other hand, which defines the impact of global warming on economic and financial activity that increase inflation. For example, between 1980 and 2020, EU member states spent the equivalent of Sweden's GDP on dealing with the aftermath of natural disaster. My message there is that we must cope with public debt in order to regain the room of maneuver that is absolutely necessary to finance our fight against climate change, which is something that we cannot exclude at all. We must absolutely stick to our commitments, and that is why, for example, if I look at Europe, the European Green Deal, which has been proposed by the Commission, must be fully respected. Finally, I would like to draw some proposals in order to address the risk I mentioned, and with the idea to recover a positive economic outlook. I'm now after being a finance minister in the 2012 and then from 2014 to 2019, EU commissioner, the head of the French Court of Auditors, la Cour des comptes française. It is an institution that controls the use of public funds. And I will, of course, promote the need to go back to healthier public finances. I don't do that because I love austerity. This is not the case. I never did that. I think that we must not impoverish our states. We need to have a strong capacity to invest and develop. But what I know is that public debt is the absolute enemy of economy and of investment. If we don't regain the room of maneuver that is necessary to finance investment, innovation, research, the fight against climate change, digital transformation, then we will be in a situation to have a low potential growth, as we require exactly the contrary. In order to do so, we must absolutely invest to stimulate growth. It is possible by making significant and coordinated investments in small and medium-sized enterprises and digital businesses through programs at the regional, national, international level. This would keep their competitiveness in the global market while making it possible to acquire knowledge and skills in terms of technology and sustainability. On the other hand, and that's my job here in this country, we need absolutely to control better our public spending. And when saying that, I'm not only thinking about the quantity of public spending, about the quality of public spending. We have some public spending that we can obviously reduce without any damage to social justice or to economic efficiency. On the contrary, we could spend less and spend better. That's what we must absolutely move to. And for that, we need to get back to structural reforms. Reducing debt is an urgent necessity. This is in particular true for emerging and developing economies with liabilities denominated in foreign exchange, as they are more vulnerable to the tightening of global financial conditions. Secondly, the current global situation requires a highly coherent environmental policy, both at financial and budgetary levels. On the one hand, climate change is both a source and a consequence of inflation. On the other hand, we need to raise public investment on green transition and to adopt specific policies at all scales. At the supranational level, and I especially think about Europe, this continent, here, policies should be implemented such as not conditioning green spending on the classic deficit rule. You may know that there is an ongoing reform of the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe. It has been suspended, and rightly so, during the COVID crisis. It will be reestablished in 2024, but it needs to be different. And I think that the Commission, my successor there, Paolo Gentiloni, is thinking in the right direction, especially by recognizing the unique characteristics of each state. The idea is that there must be a more national approach of these problems and adopting standards that are tailored to them. Ownership is a key word there. At a national level, governments' efforts towards green transition are more urgent than ever, and states have already taken steps in this direction. For instance, in the upcoming decades, more than 1 trillion euros will be invested in green industrial facilities in northern Sweden. They will contribute to the Swedish power systems innovation, extensive skill development, as well as new partnerships and commercial models. As, again, the president of the French Court of Auditors, I also wish to contribute, and I ask my team to focus our 2024 annual report, this is something the French know well, on policies and resources regarding green growth and ecological transition. Third, and finally, we need a renewed global system of tax justice or tax fairness. This new framework could be implemented around two main axes. We must first protect the resources leverage in light of the limited public finances and escalating inequalities. For instance, when the French government was reviewing its 2023 finance law, I emphasized the necessity of offsetting any tax reduction. Otherwise, there is a significant danger that the budget will be burdened by lower revenue, which would lead to worse disparities. Of course, I advocate for diminishing taxes, but we must do that when we have the resources or room and maneuver to do so. Globally speaking, we must be mindful of maintaining the proper balance in our tax systems. To this end, the reform of a minimum 15% worldwide company tax, which is presently being negotiated within the OECD here, would stand out as a significant innovation, something I also advocated when I served as European Commissioner for Tax. And this change could enhance annual national budgets by up to $100 billion, which could be used to pay public services like hospitals, schools, infrastructure. It was approved by the EU, by the Council on Wednesday, and this is a great achievement. In conclusion, global economy uncertainty calls for a polymorphic action aimed at preventing all crises that produce the worst outcomes for the world economy. In a difficult environment of higher inflation, weaker growth, tighter financial conditions, limited room for fiscal policy, governments will have to redefine their spending priorities, shifting them towards targeted aid for vulnerable populations and ecological transition, which is for me the absolute priority of the times to come. Global arenas like this conference of Paris are crucial to this matter, and we need to safeguard economic liberties, social equity and fraternity among nations worldwide, and this event contributes to that. Thank you very much for listening.